Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our interview with Dr. Matias Schmidt. I don't think we need further introduction on the work that Dr. Matias has done in terms of Kava, and I think we are far more interested in hearing about actually the Kava content. So we are going to delve straight into it. And I believe I will begin with what seemed to be a very big question, which is, Dr. Schmidt, how would you describe kava to someone who has never consumed kava or heard of it in the first place? And we're talking about kava, Kava, not the sparkling wine, Cava.
Of course. Yes. No, I think kava is one of the most fascinating plants that is used either for food use or for medicinal use that exists on this world. Well, my experiments dates back to the 1990s, where I started first theoretically with kava, and I found it really fascinating because anything I saw with the clinical experience showed that this is really effective. And it has the big advantage to avoid problems you have, for example, with alcohol or whatever. It doesn't numb your mind, but it still calms you down and makes you more focused on whatever you're doing. And that is really exceptional because any other medicinal plant I know that has psychoactive effects would have some effect on your thinking, on your psychological status. Kava doesn't really do that. And for me, the most fascinating thing is first time I used Kava, I didn't feel anything. I drank it, I said, yeah, okay, nothing happened. Wrong. After that, I had a presentation to give for EU officials in Brussels, and I wasn't even nervous. I said something is strange here because normally speaking to these guys, I'm not familiar in these to these circles, so I was always very nervous. I wasn't at all, and then I realized that's the Kava effect. And that is really great because there's nothing else that can do that. And so it was really a pity when Kava was banned because that for many patients it meant going back to alcohol.
Indeed. And I must say, from my personal experience, when I consumed kava, I found it to be very relaxing. I found myself very relaxed the next day as well. So the effect was quite prolonged for me, which I very much enjoyed. And I was always able to drive home. I mean, I didn't drink huge amounts, but it doesn't impair on your judgment. And I completely agree on the view on about teetotalitarian movements. And I think we might come to that later on as more and more people, particularly younger people, do not want to consume alcohol anymore in today's age. They turn into alternatives, and that may very well be kava. Well, so let's discuss a bit more then the ban. So, to begin with, can you please explain to us what triggered the German regulatory action against kava in the early 2000s?
Yes, that is a pretty complicated question because what happened was we saw a signal of potential liver toxicity by Kava at the time. But you have to know that something else was happening at the same time. I don't know whether you ever heard about the Lipobar scandal that started in 1998. And it was a problem because the company Bayer at that time, by law, they had to inform their stakeholders before they informed BfArM, our regulatory authority, about the adverse events that they had observed. Now, when they informed the stakeholders, suddenly BfArM was bombarded by the media and was bombarded by patients about the risk of this medication, and BfArM was taken completely unawares. So now you imagine that at that point they were crucified, of course, by the media as incompetent or whatever. Uh, and then suddenly we observed in the same year, in 1999, then while the Lipobar scandal was still active, we observed 10 cases of liver adverse events in Switzerland with a Kava preparation. And as a consequence, BfArM did not hesitate and they just pulled the plug. They just said, okay, we ban immediately, then we are not questioned about our competence anymore. So that was ultimately the reason why the whole thing started at all. If that hadn't happened with Lipobuy, maybe things would have been a little different, and we might have discussed with the regulators, but that way it was no longer possible. So Kava was, in fact, a victim of unfortunate circumstances.
Indeed. And to those of us who don't know, can you explain what lipid balm is in sort of layman's terms, I think, just in case someone's watching and they don't know these scientific terms. And just to clarify, BIFRAM is the largest regulatory medicine regulatory authority in Europe, and it is the authority in Germany.
It is the authority
Yes.
in Germany. So the authority in Europe would be EMA, the European Medicines Agency, but these preparations were authorized, the cover preparations were authorized under the heading of BfArM in the 1990s. So this was still before EMA, before the European Medicines Agency was really founded. And about Lipobuy, yes, Lipobuy was a medication for cardiac disorders, and they had some deaths, sudden deaths, because there was one adverse event they didn't really anticipate. Uh, Now we know where it came from. It's part of the mechanism. Yeah, it could have been avoided, but in the heat of the process, of course, you have to take decisions. And ultimately, Lipobuy was banned in 2001. So they withdrew it from the market in 2001, and in the same year, we also had the withdrawal of Kava.
Great. Thank you very much. Both answers very helpful. Now, turning into some of the products that were banned during the decision in 2002, what sort of cover products were banned? Because when I was talking to some UK consumers or people who used to like buying Kava, they used to tell me that they would buy it off the shelf from, a shop like Boots, which is a sort of a large retailer that sells on the counter medication and herbs and other products. So some people reported using tablets. Obviously, the traditional way of mixing kava, as we know, is dry powder mixed with cold water. So tell us a bit more about the different types of products and which ones were implicated.
Yeah, that is a very important question because this is something, this is always, many people get it wrong in the debate. The whole ban thing in 2001 was not about Kava as such. It was about medicinal products in Germany authorized for a specific indication. So they were all except one. They were ethanolic extracts of Kava roots and Kava rhizomes. One was an acetone extract, and this acetone extract was, by the way, the one that was taken in the case reports from Switzerland. So this was, for me, it was a clear signal that something was wrong with the quality of this one preparation. Now, if they ban these preparations, and BfArM did that, they withdraw the marketing authorizations. So that meant these products could no longer be sold. That, of course, had repercussions about across Europe and especially to the food market, because the food market in Europe is defined as safe. So that means any item you use for food, uh, also for food supplements, for example, is by definition safe. But if there is a problem with one of these ingredients in the food, then that food would not be allowed anymore to the market. And this was the consequence here, that because of that only German debate, we suddenly had Europe-wide a ban of Kava products sold as food supplements. And that is what you would have gotten as when you go to Booth, for example. That is exactly that kind of product that was not implicated, but was a collateral victim.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. I think that provides lots of clarity to those who were uh, alive and were able to see the products on the shelf. And then all of a sudden, which was pretty much an overnight decision here in the UK, because when I was speaking to some people who used to buy the product, particularly school teachers who used to feel very stressed at work and actually found really relaxing effects with Kava, and all of a sudden it no longer existed. So that was a great shame to many of those people. So, were these products traditional kava preparations? Were they pills, extracts? So, I've talked a bit about pills. What were the commercial products effectively that were available, and how was that part of the ban, and sort of how did the regulatory authorities look at it from that way?
Well, we are talking about maybe 15 different companies that were implicated in this process because BfArM uh, took up all the marketing authorizations that existed at that point, and these companies had different types of products on the market. So most of them were tablets or capsules with ethanolic extracts. There was also these, as I already said, these acetone extract in capsules. And there was at least two products at least that were liquid oral drops. All of them were standardized to cover lactone contents. So we had a regulation that said you can have in the daily dose up to 120 milligrams of kava lactones, the main ingredient of kava, the main effective ingredient of kava is kavain, which is called a kava lactone from the chemical structure. Um, and they were all standardized to this amount of carbolactones in the daily dose. So, for example, a tablet with 120 milligrams, you would take one tablet a day. A capsule with 50 milligram, you would take two a day. Uh, that was part of the marketing authorization. So that is what was sold here as medicinal products. But of course, you also had in other countries food supplements, for example, but they were not part of the German ban. This is not in the under the responsibility of BfArM.
Great, thank you very much. And would you be able to give us just roughly sort of the figures for suppose mixing kava? So if you mix kava, how much of these numbers would in milligrams, for instance, would you be able to give something to help us better understand?
Mixing cover, what do you mean by that?
So when you mix kava with water,
Ah, okay,
would you be able
yes.
to give us a number, for instance, just roughly, like in a traditional shell, or in a 100 milli water shell,
Yeah,
how
yeah, yeah,
much?
I
Yes.
understand. Now, yes, if you have 120 milligrams, that would approximately be one coconut shell. So one coconut shell you get in by kava drinking contains about between 100 and 200 milligrams of kava lactones. So this daily dose would correspond to approximately one kava shell. But now you know exactly that people out there in the Pacific, they drink usually in one evening 3 to 5 shells. So they get up to 1 gram of kava lactones without any problem. So for us, of course, the question was if kava were really toxic, it should have a mandatory toxicity. We are using just 1/5 of what the usual dose would be by traditional kava drinking. Why don't we see similar effects from traditional kava drinking? And why did we only have these effects from this one single product on the German market?
Thank you. That is very helpful to make, I think, to visualize for many who might be listening. Now, turning to my second part of this interview and question, you were in our symposium in March, which I thought was a very good opportunity for us to highlight the cause of kava in the UK, and we had many distinguished visitors, yourself included. And the inspiration for this interview came from your presentation. Um, Now, since then as well, our executive director, Douglas LaRose, was also inspired to write an article, I believe, to the Fiji Times on your particular presentation. And I think we will link the article in our bio and in the caption of this interview. And he basically he discusses the view that the UK ban is rooted in a deep misunderstanding. So, do you share that assessment? And what do you think the next steps forward should be for trying to get kava legalized in the UK first and then in the EU?
Well, absolutely, I agree that it is a huge misunderstanding. It has always been a huge misunderstanding. I think one of the biggest problems here was that the UK believed that BfArM did its homework, and that if a decision comes from BfArM, it must have been thoroughly done, which was unfortunately not the case. So most of the European, no, all of the European countries followed suit with a ban without having any own case reports. UK had 4 case reports at that time, but if you look into them, you see that they are not really, there's no really good reason to think that it was caused by Kava. So this is why I think we should go back to the roots. We should really no longer say, oh yeah, there have been 100 case reports. They may have been 100 case reports, but by quantity is not quality. If you have 100 case reports of very poor quality, it doesn't give you proof that Kava is really dangerous. So what you should do in this case, and this has been done by some experts, look into the case reports and just sort out what is rubbish and keep what is really sufficient to argue a given risk, and then uh, take it from there and restart the debate. Because this has not been done. This hasn't been done in the past 25 years. And I ask myself, why? What are they afraid of? They might simply find that you reduce the number of case reports to maybe 3 or 4. And does that then really justify a ban? And I think no, because you would always have to consider what does that mean for the overall incidence of similar case reports from other reasons, like spontaneous liver injury, for example, that exists. So now you would have to see whether it sticks out from the clutter. You have a certain percentage of such effects appearing without any known cause. And if you have, let's say, 100 cases of spontaneous reports and 2 cases of cover reports, or potentially cover related reports, you would find out that the statistics do not allow you to draw the conclusion that you have to ban it altogether. So this is a statistical question that has never been used, and I think it's time to go back into the facts and not just simply repeat, "Oh my, it's dangerous because there have been 100 case reports."
That's a very good point, and that I was going to ask you about what is the most important point both regulatory authorities need to understand. But I think you've read my mind. Maybe the Kava powers have enabled you to do so, and I think these are very important points to make. And an outright ban is never the answer when you suspect there might be something. Um, that leads me to my next follow-up, which is how can scientific evidence, modern quality standards, and specific stakeholder engagements be brought together in the next phase of legislation work? So, what would you like to see as a piece of scientific evidence that would help disprove these claims that BIFRA and the UK Food Standards Authority might have?
There are 2 levels to this question. The one is about the quality of the kava itself, because what we saw in the beginning in the year 2000 was that there is an indication of a poor quality of the material used in the medicinal product that caused the case reports in Switzerland. So we have been working for many, many years to have a proper quality definition of kava. It has been done in the meantime. There is this Codex Alimentarius. I would have liked to have that 20 years ago, but unfortunately, yeah, we cannot turn back times. But yeah, this is very important that that we know what we are talking about. We should clearly say we are not talking about something strange or something that is not recommended to do in the South Pacific. We are talking about noble kava, but nothing else. We have the quality standards, we adhere to them. That is important to show. So this is the first level. The second level then, of course, is if the regulators will want toxicological proof. So you would probably have to deliver some toxicological study, even though there are already quite a lot of toxicological studies on kava. But none of these studies has ever asked for the quality of the starting material. So if you can combine that, if you can say we have a defined quality, we have this toxicity study, the regulator should be happy. Should be. if they don't come up with something else.
Well, this is a question that has always baffled me in my career. How do I please the regulators? Um, Actually, that made me just think. I think we ought to mention for those who are listening, um, the difference in kava quality. Now, of course, I don't want to compare it to wine, but perhaps we can explain that each region, in fact, the different type of soil can radically change the composition of the kava that you are consuming. So can we just have a few sentences on that and sort of kava quality and just elaborate a bit more on that and what you mean and how we can sometimes have strong kava, fresh kava today, etc.
I would rather compare it to coffee than to wine because with wine it's a bit more complicated. But in yes, we do have about 120 different varieties of cava all over the place in the South Pacific. But if you do the chemical analysis, you may come down to maybe 80 because there's a strong overlap. So what they do is they developed cava from a wild type called Pipa bichmani from Papua New Guinea. And that one was not used for drinking. That was used for fishing. It was a to relax the fish, then you can grab them. And it has been found a long time ago, maybe 1,500 years ago, that if you drink that, it has some relaxing effects. And they grew that into modern kava by planting and by just trying out, finding the effects by replanting. And this is how, especially in Vanuatu, where all this started, you have a huge variety in each island. You have different types of kava. There are some that grow everywhere. There's types, for example, called Milo Milo or Borogu, which you find in many islands there, which are favored. And ultimately, over time, they developed a distinction between three different types. One medicinal type, which you would only use when you're sick, for certain medicinal reasons. And then there is the so-called two-day kava, which is sometimes consumed but usually avoided because it gives you a headache and makes you sick for 2 days. This is where the name comes from. And there's the so-called noble kava, which doesn't have these effects and which is you can drink quite a lot of it. If you drink too much, you go to sleep for 8 hours, you wake up, you're fine. So no issue with that, except that maybe you need to find a bed pretty soon. uh, and yes, so this noble kava is the count standard of good kava quality, and as I say, this is similar with coffee. You decide what kind of coffee you want to drink now by your current mood. Let's say today, I want an espresso. Now I want a cappuccino or whatever. So in this case, it's a different type of preparation that makes the difference, and not with kava because kava the preparation is more or less always the same. But there the difference comes from the different varieties. One is a bit stronger, one is a bit weaker, one has a longer lasting effect, and so on. So people know that. People go to the shop and say, okay, I want that kind of kava today. And that is then used in the cover session. Yes, so you have a distinction by taste, but not necessarily by effect, because the effect is the same. It's just a question of strength and duration.
Great, thank you very much. The only reason I compared it to wine and not to coffee because I actually don't like coffee, and I do find it very funny when people say I can't start my day without a cup of coffee or I start shaking if I don't drink coffee, and I didn't want people to relate that to kava, but I think the point that you make is very valid and it is a good way of trying to explain it. Mind you, I think kava is a lot better than coffee because it doesn't have caffeine in it.
Right.
So
You don't start to shake. Yeah.
yes, and you don't shake. Yes.
But
Um,
I can completely agree because I'm a tea drinker as well as myself. I don't drink coffee.
Indeed, we are the team of infusion team. That's we should name ourselves to that. Um, Now, turning to the toxicology study that you mentioned, and sort of this is the important piece of legislation that you think might help us crack the puzzle here. Was there proven toxicity when the original decision was made, or was that a precautionary response? Um,
Completely precautionary.
Completely precautionary, yes? And how strong was the evidence of causality at the time?
Pretty weak, except for these first 10 cases from Switzerland, from which four were pretty well described. And then you can say, okay, there is a good reason to think that Kava was the origin. But I say Kava was the origin. In this case, it was two-day Kava. We know that. And there's even a hint that it was not even two-day Kava, but Makas. So this is for those who do not know what that is. If you have Kava ceremonies or Kava sessions in the South Pacific, you have the leftovers after extraction, and these still contain Kava lactones. So for this company, it was still interesting to have that because it was cheap. It didn't cost a lot. It was just residues, but you still could extract cavalactones from that. So they bought that and it came to Germany in barrels, but it was humid. And what we suspect is that we had some mold formation in there. So it was a bit more than meets the eye. It was not just the question of noble or two-day. It may have been something much more dangerous than that. But it's probably hard to prove. We only have circumstantial evidence for that. Well, we have the pictures. We can show that these barrels reached Germany and that they were probably also used for the extraction. But for that, of course, we didn't stand next to the extractor.
Great, that's very helpful. Actually, I did not know about the mold formation, so even for me, I'm learning something new every day. So you share the view that the ban would not have been justified, and that what should have been triggered instead was further investigation or
Yes.
looking at quality control or other measures such as these.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. We had the toxicological evidence for the ethanolic extract. I myself published one of these studies. I don't know whether I put my name on it or whether it was published under Sorrentino. It was made in Italy at the time. But yes, this is why I know exactly that we had the toxicological evidence. We had the studies, and it was okay during the marketing authorization process. And when the ban came, they never looked into that. They just said, "No, we have case reports. We pull the plug." That's it. So the evidence was not really investigated, and also the question of toxicological studies was not investigated. And then to anticipate your next question, the argument was shifting. We had first of course, the argument that kava is dangerous, and that is why it had to be banned. And then during the court investigations, BfArM switched to the argument that it was not efficacious. And if kava is not efficacious, any given risk, whatever it is, it could be a headache or it could be a blue big two or whatever, uh, would be just one adverse effect too much. And they say you have to do this risk balance ratio. So you have benefit to risk ratio. So you balance the existing benefits against existing risks. And if there is no benefit, the risk is of course always exceeding the benefit, and that means if that is the case, you have to withdraw the marketing authorization. That was the argument of BfArM. Then, after they said, okay, yeah, we are not sure of that all these case reports really relate or not, but there is still the hypothesis that kava may cause liver toxicity, and it has no efficacy. Of course not, because none of these people has ever tasted kava. So you can easily say it is not efficacious because I never tried it. But yeah, that was where they said it has no effect, and if it has no effect, any risk is the reason to ban. That is something we of course fought in court.
Mm.
We showed them we have the clinical studies, and then again, BfArM, well, no, at that point, BfArM came to us and said, okay, yeah, you can do a clinical trial, and then the problem is solved. So I myself came up with a clinical trial protocol. We went to BfArM, we had a meeting there in 2006. We presented that, and they said, yeah, it's nice, but we do not allow you to do that the trial because kava is toxic. I
Oh.
said, What are we talking about here? You're just shifting the goalposts again. So that was the end of the clinical trial. And after that, they came back with another argument. They said, yeah, but it is not efficacious against generalized anxiety. I said, what's that about? Generalized anxiety? We never asked for that. This is a completely different indication. Our indication was nervous anxiety and nervous restlessness, not generalized anxiety. This is a completely different thing. Yeah, but that is still the actual state of the art. They say, no, it's not efficacious against generalized anxiety, so we ban. Negative benefit to risk ratio. That
So
is where we stand today.
so effectively, what has happened is the argument shifted from the regulators from toxicity when challenged, and then talking more about efficacy
Yes,
generally, while still relating to toxicity as a reason for you not to go ahead with
exactly.
efficacy examinations. So the shifting goalposts, as you explained, makes it extremely tricky to try and work with the regulators in solving this particular misunderstanding. Um, so, what do you think needs to be done in order to resolve that need or by the regulators to try and shift the goalposts? And how can we get them to better understand Kava? Because it is a niche product, and it's if it tries and goes through the regular streamline method of food or beverage approval, we won't get anywhere.
No, that's true because the food regulators simply look at the assessment of cover being a risk product, and since food items cannot have a risk in Europe, the decision for them is pretty easy. So my suggestion would in that case be we should make them aware that this whole discussion is about a very tiny segment of the market. It's about German authorized medicinal products in this specific form and used for a specific indication. What we are talking about here is food use in much higher quantities, of course, and much higher exposure, uh, where you do not claim a certain indication. You cannot do that for food because food cannot have a medicinal use. Otherwise, it would be a medicine. Uh, so yes, I think it's time to go back to the starting point and say, okay, does it really have a risk? Where's the risk proven? Where can you show that Kava is at risk? But no, Kava is not at risk. The patients are at risk, of course. Uh, if you can show that that discussion doesn't lead us anywhere because it hasn't been proven properly, then suddenly you can divide between this niche market for medicinal use and the bigger food market for non-medicinal use, because then you can say, okay, risk has been excluded. There's no more evidence preventing us from coming to the market, and then you can go on from there. But that means that you probably have to show the food regulators a toxicological study.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And when you look at the study, um, do we would we try and explain, for instance, the different types of cover products, extraction methods, plant parts, cultivars, etc., or what do we look at in that particular study?
Yeah, this is a very complicated question. In fact, you would not go for, probably not go for extracts. You might also want to ask, what about CO2 extracts? These are very, very specific things. And if you do uh, an application for a novel food in Europe, that would, of course, not be accepted as non-novel because it hasn't been on the market before 1997 in sufficient amounts or at all. So it would be considered novel food, and then you have to bring the evidence anyway. So what we are talking about is the traditional type of extraction, the aqueous type of extracting. Okay, you may say, okay, my specific preparation has still some coconut milk added or whatever. That's different. But let's go for the aqueous preparation as it is done traditionally. You could also go for an aqueous extraction industrial size, but then you have to show the equivalence, but that can be done. So it is not so much the type of preparation. The type of preparation is pretty clear. It is more the question, what material are you using? And as I said before, you have these 80 to 120 different varieties, and you have a certain number of them being, most of them being noble. Would the regulators accept that you're doing a toxicological study on Melo Melo and apply it for Borogu? Big question. We do not know that. But it would practically, from my perspective, it would be impossible to do 80 different toxicological study for 80 different varieties. So I think we should first have to come up with some arguments that we can group these things, that we are talking about toxicity of noble kava, not of toxicity of melo melo, or toxicity of borogu, or toxicity of whatever variety you're using. And
Great.
that, by the way, can be done by chemical means. So was part of my work. I went to the South Pacific and I took samples of all the noble varieties, not only noble, I also took samples of the others, but all of the varieties that are planted there and used and consumed. And I did the chemical analysis exactly for that reason, to see whether you can find a common parameter that can be used for the distinction. It can be done. So my suggestion has always been then, do not go for the specific single variety, go for the group of noble kava. And another reason for that is that kava is constantly changing. It's still evolving. And even I saw when I was there in the South Pacific, I saw some new varieties that didn't exist a few years before, because they are constantly mutating, and people try them and say, okay, that one is good, we keep it. It would be impossible to restrict yourself to a certain variety because you do not know where you stand 10 years from now.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And to those who don't know, can we just have a brief definition of what CO2 extracts are?
That's a fascinating technology that is, by the way, also used for cannabis. They are using it for the extraction of tetrahydrocannabinol and CBD for the cannabidiol. Um, this is, you can use CO2. When you pressurize CO2, it becomes liquid. And as a liquid, it can be used as an extraction solvent. So what you do is you mix your plant material with liquid CO2, and it extracts certain ingredients, mostly the lipophilic, the more fat-soluble ingredients. And then what you do is simply you reduce the pressure, and poof, the CO2 is gone. You can recuperate it and use it again. Uh, and you have an extract. And that extract can then be purified. You can do other things with that. You have a raw extract that can be further processed. But the difference is here, what you have in this raw extract is things that you would never have in an aqueous extract. I haven't done the analysis for kava, but I have seen them for cannabis. So when you do cannabis extraction with CO2, what you get in the first step is a lot of chlorophyll, the green stuff in the plant. You get a lot of waxes or fats, and you don't want them in your extract. You have to get rid of them. So you have the next step would be a purification step. But that means if you do a CO2 extract with kava, you come up with a lot of ingredients that are not extracted in regular water extraction, because water uh, it does not really give you an extract. So what you do is you take the kava, you have it either fresh or in powder. Um, you you press it, you put it in a bag, and you squeeze it in water, so that the active ingredients can get into the water, but they are not dissolved. What you get is a suspension of tiny little droplets, and these tiny droplets contain the cavalactones. It's a resinous droplets. When you take these cavalactones as such, as a block of 1 gram, for example, nothing would happen. It would just pass your intestines, and you would drop it into the toilet, but nothing else happens. So you need these tiny little droplets because they are absorbed. And this is, by the way, the reason why when you are doing a kava session and you are giving a cup of a coconut shell of kava, people usually take this cup, they put it into the tanneware, they pour it back 3 times. This is a ritual, and after 3 times, you are getting the cup. You are being served the cup. Why do you do that? Because these droplets tend to separate from the water, and you need to remix them. This is what tradition has always known from experience, and that is something you have to consider in the distinction between the different extract forms. So the CO2 extract is a completely different chemical entity than the aqueous preparation.
That it's very fascinating to see how tradition creates a certain way of doing something, and then science later on justifies it.
Justifies this.
And it is just simply so fascinating. And I just hope we can get to a stage where we can same that principle when discussing Kava with regulators and explaining to them, well, finding the evidence to justify Kava legality. That is very interesting. Thank you for sharing that story. And turning now to what you mentioned earlier about court decisions, and you've said you went to court in 2006, for example. So can you tell us a bit more about all these later court hearings and what was the response? Did they uphold the original decision? And did they disagree with it? So just tell us a bit more about the later court cases and their outcome.
Well, the first court case was in 2014. Why was it so late? This has regulatory reasons because BfArM never issued a final decision until 2012. That was when we twisted their arms and said, okay, if you do not give us a decision, we were going to sue you for inactivity. And that helped. We got the decision. It was negative, of course, but that was anticipated. And we could go to court. We could not go to court before because, by definition, you can only go to court when you have a final decision. And that final decision was delayed by 10 years. So that was, of course, well, I would say it was intentional because it helped them getting the whole thing under the carpet. And now we went to court, and the first thing happened was that the court said the ban was inappropriate because the alternatives BfArM was suggesting at that point was benzodiazepines, and the judge said you can't be serious. If you are using benzodiazepines instead of kava, you will have much more problems than just from drinking kava or from having kava tablets. And that was why the first court round in court was won. It went to the upper court in 2014. We had the session at the upper administrative court in Münster in Germany, and they confirmed the first ruling. So that was it. So technically, after that, Kava could have come back to the market, but BfArM was delaying that for other reasons. They said, before you come back, you first have to do this and this and this and this. Took some time. So we came back, and it effectively one company really put it back to the market, and they sold 2 or 3 packages for technical reasons because they had to prove BfArM that it was on the market, and they had to prove the judge, and it worked. So that was in the next round where where BfArM had declined the new application forms for Kava for technical reasons because they said it's not efficacious or whatever. They said we are gonna take away these marketing authorizations for good. They had been reinstalled in the meantime, but they were taking them, we are withdrawing them again. We went to court again, and in that case, the court said yes, it can come back, it must come back under certain precautions. So we had to put in some warning labels into the package leaflets. We said, okay, yes, we're going to do that. Most importantly, Kava is back. But after that, BfArM came back again, and they had another regulatory trick. So they prevented the product from really coming back to the market, and that led to another court hearing about 5 years. That was shortly before Corona, in the beginnings of the 2020s. We were again in court, and we won that again, and we are now waiting for the hearing at the upper administrative court, and that has taken 5 years, and nothing is happening. So it will come one day, but we don't know when. And I'm pretty confident that again that will be the outcome will be positive, but don't expect Kava to be back anytime soon.
Well, that is a great shame. But to just explain better the differences between the court process and the regulator's process. So in court, you're not really trying to prove the questions about efficacy and toxicity, or are you? You're just trying to see what the regulators can and cannot do in their authority. Is that correct? Or
Exactly.
what's... Yes.
Because the court cannot really address the question whether science is sufficient or not. But what they can do is they can address the question whether a decision taken by regulators is according to the legislation or not. And that they did. They did not question the Kava efficacy. They did not question Kava toxicity. They just said, okay, if this question is discussed and you deliver that kind of documentation, either it is sufficient or it is not sufficient. That they did.
So they would not assess whether Kava is risk-free, for example, or they would not say, oh, the regulator need to distinguish Kava by its different
No,
products or categories. They would not say something like that, would they?
no.
No.
No, that
Mm,
would not be within their scope,
mm,
the latter point, because the judge can only rule for a specific product. So they would not compare that with potentially other products out there because it's not part of the ruling. The ruling is you go there and say, I have been treated unjustly because my product is not allowed to the market. So the judge will not say, okay, but your neighbor's product is on the market. Let's look at that. He would say, let's look at your product, whether you did anything according to the regulation or not.
indeed. So we can't, there isn't a legal way for us to try and not force, but sort of allow the regulator to recognize Kava and its different categories.
No, probably not. This is why I said you have to define a category for yourself. And then if you go for the food sector, especially, they will expect certain scientific evidence, and that you have to deliver, of course. And the biggest problem is here that you have to avoid the issue that they might say, oh, well, but you have 80 different varieties. So that grouping is extremely important.
Great, thank you. Now, turning from the German, now we've explained in great depth the German experience, Kava and efficacy, and all these, all that important context and background. We can talk about the German experience and its link to the UK ban. Um, so, to those who don't know, after the Germans made their decision in the UK, I believe there was a very short consultation period in 2002. Uh, and then afterwards, we used what we call secondary legislation, which means ministerial powers and not primary legislation, to impose a ban on the sale, supply, and importation of kava to the UK. So my question is, in your view, to what extent was the UK prohibition introduced in the same climate of concern as the German ban? Was there cooperation at the time, or was it sort of, oh, we just saw what the largest regulatory authority in Europe, which was in Germany, doing at the time, and we decided to copy that? Or what was the rationale there?
I was not involved in the details of the British decision at that time, but we visited the MHRA at that time, and we saw the same reaction as with BfArM. They just block. We don't want to talk about that, except if you do a completely new marketing authorization application for marketing authorization according to latest standards. So that was the message we got from that meeting. But otherwise, UK had only 4 case reports that are in this list of these 100, and all 4 of them are not really convincing. So what I would think is that, in fact, they used the arguments from BfArM, and they used the experience from BfArM in this whole issue, but did not do an own assessment.
It is so frustrating to know that for them, four is enough to impose a ban, but four to prove otherwise, that we don't need a ban, is not sufficient. So, it is quite frustrating, and it
Yes.
does feel very unjust and very unfair, which is why when I speak with, when I campaign and speak with politicians and the members of the diaspora, I always call it an unfair or an unjust
Yes.
decision because. It strikes at the core of the message because we are trying to do all this in good faith. But sadly, the goalposts keep shifting, and it makes it very tricky for us to try and get the science if every time we try and go about it, the regulator tries and play this long game of not letting us for a different reason. I'd like to talk more then about how the UK should now revisit the ban in light of the German experience. We've talked about how the German bases was inappropriate. We talked about how there is no scientific justification to maintain a prohibition. So let's talk about how we move forward now in the UK. How should we revisit the ban?
Yeah. So as I think we talked about that before, what is most important is go back to the roots and really
Mm.
investigate the reason for the ban, which was the case reports. And if the case reports do not stand up to the evidence, to the required evidence, that should already be a reason to revisit the ban.
Great, thank you very much. That is very helpful for us to think about. And I think when we need to look at this root of the problem, as you explained, I think it's very important to look at the modern quality standard requirements, I think. And if the UK were to move away from a prohibition towards controlled access to start off with, what would a modern cover quality standard need to include?
The typical, well, let's say it's easy to check first the way how a monograph in the European Pharmacopoeia is built, because that already gives you all the information you need. And that is always the same. You have a test for the identity, you have a test for the purity, which is mostly the contaminants like aflatoxins, so mold formation, which is important in this case because it that can be a problem if cover is not properly dried, but it can cause toxicity. Pesticide use would have to be controlled, heavy metals would have to be controlled, microbiology is probably a big issue there. Yes, so you can easily build a quality standard where you can say that is the quality I can accept. You'd have an assay on the cavalactones, and you would have to define what would be the standard composition. As I told you before, you have different varieties like noble and two-day kava, and they differ in their cavalactone composition. For example, noble kava has a lot of cavain. A two-day kava has a lot of methysticin, for example, or dihydromethysticin, which gives you a different effect. There can be differences in the flavocavins, flavocavin A and B especially. This is something where you can differentiate between the groups of noble and non-noble. So that you need to define. You have to say, okay, this is what I'm testing for, and this is what I'm using. Now, unfortunately, fortunately, we do have the Codex Alimentarius in the meantime, but unfortunately, we still have people out there in the Pacific who give a about that. There is especially one guy in Vanuatu who has been selling two-day kava for the past 20 years, 25 years, and he is still proud of it. But yeah, that needs to be stopped.
So I think there's a need to present a good image around that, particularly to
Yes,
support Fijian, general
exactly.
farmers in the Pacific, whether it is Vanuatu or Fiji or Tonga.
Yes,
Um,
and that is exactly what I told people in these meetings
mm,
during my EU projects for the quality of cover in the South Pacific in these meetings, that if they want us Europeans to accept that Kava is a valuable item and it has a good history of safe use and everything, they need to make sure that only the good Kava is effectively sold. But because what cannot happen is that you use the good stuff for yourself, and the bad stuff you say, okay, I can make money out of that. This is not the way it should be. So either you're proud of your material, then sell the good stuff, or you're not, then you're doomed.
Great. So should the UK then, should the UK quality standard require noble cultivars only to start with? Should we sort of look at that category first?
Yes, absolutely. That
And
is
then,
because this is the question the regulators
mm,
will ask at some point. They didn't do it yet because the German regulators still are using the argument of efficacy. But once that is sorted out, they will come back to the quality issue. They will use that as the next block.
and the FSA in the UK will hopefully should or it should treat the different product categories differently, such as dried root powder or CO2 extracts, etc., etc.
Yeah. CO2 extract is completely different, of
Yeah.
course. And even you could even say that ethanol or acetone extract are different because it's a completely different type of preparation. I frankly, I never saw any difference between an ethanol extract and a water extract. But this is a thing you would have to justify separately. But technically, it's different preparations, and you should do that. I wouldn't completely make a distinct. I wouldn't make a complete distinction between fresh kava or dry kava
Mm.
extraction with water, because this is something else. It would come out to the same product. People say that fresh kava has a stronger effect, but that is a question of effect strength and not about safety.
Great, thank you. And what labeling requirements think would be necessary around cultivar, plant part, preparation methods, the
Yes.
information and warnings such as these?
That's a very good question because it takes us very deep into the required process, starting from the planting. You have in Europe the GACP rules, well, they are not European, the WHO created them, and they are now also in the regulation for GACP for plant material coming to Europe. GACP means good agriculture and collection practice. And that means any type of plant material you're importing to Europe must have a proper documentation starting from the field to the processing and the preparation of the finished product. You need the traceability of the material. You need to show where it came from, what was planted, when was it planted, how was it treated, did you do any pesticide application, did you do any remediation for microbiology, whatever. All that needs to be documented. Currently, it is not, because for Kava, you do not have the proper GSCP standards in place for most of the cultivators. Some have started to do something like that. Yes, some have a quality management system, but you need to install that. And that is a big issue, and that needs to be done as soon as possible. But who can do that? The Kava Coalition probably cannot do that, or maybe they can help, they can assist. But this is something between the client and the supplier. But you just have to be aware that you can only have a proper definition of what you're doing when you can show that what you claim to do is really done. And that needs documentation. And that needs a so-called HACCP protocol in your farm or in your processing company, and hazard and critical control point analysis, which means that all the processes you do need to be examined for risks, for validation, uh, and for documentation.
Great. Yes, I think clarity is always appreciated by civil servants because it allows
Yeah,
them to present the case to their superiors or their
absolutely.
political masters. And that's very important, I think, because many politicians don't even know what kava is. So for them to reverse a ban legally, they need to defer to the judgment of their civil servants. And we need to try our best to change hearts and minds on that particular issue. So that leads me to sort of the last follow-up from that section, which is, could this kind of specification help satisfy the criteria for Kava? to be assessed as a food rather than being treated as a undifferentiated medicinal risk.
That would not, for me, it would not make a difference,
Mm.
because the specification would be very similar whether it is food or whether it is a medicinal product, a raw material for medicinal product production. They call for more or less exactly the same type of specification. So what I just said about the contaminants would be exactly the same for food or for medicinal products. For food, it's maybe even stricter than for medicinal products because there you still have to add some more pesticides, or you may have to ask for further quality questions. Remains to be seen, but that is something that can be done. It just adds to the overall quality image you're giving.
Indeed. And I think this is why it's very important for us to say that the UK prohibition is not scientifically sensible or proportionate, I think. And that leads us to the next segment, which is how would a regulated legal access allow the UK to manage risk more effectively than the prohibition itself?
Well, you would have to do testing. Whoever does that testing, but that normally on the medicinal market, it's relatively easy because the pharmaceutical company receives the material, does have to do the entry control, material entry controls according to a specification. You have to make sure that all these contaminants are absent, that you fulfill your specification, your pharmacopoeia of monograph, if there is any, there is none for Kava. But then in that case, you would go for the Codex Alimentarius monograph and come up with your own specification, which is accepted by the regulators. So you say, okay, I told the regulators what I'm doing. They're happy with that. When the material comes in, you do the testing, you're controlled for that. So what happens for medicinal product production is that you have your local government. In our case, I'm living in Bavaria. It would be the government of Upper Bavaria. They come every 3 years. They check your company. They say we want to see the examples of these COAs, of these certificates of analysis, and they check whether everything is according to the regulations. So you're under very strict control. You also have strict controls for the food sector, but there the specifications are a little different. What because I don't know about inspections of regulators coming to food sectors, checking these contaminants, for example. But what they do is they take samples. So that regularly happens, that they take samples of food items, they send them to a laboratory, let the laboratory do the testing, and they come back with a with some critics saying, "You're selling here something that is full of cadmium, for example, or mercury." So then you are in trouble. So this is something you would avoid from out of your own interest. When you are producing a material from Kava, for example, it is in your own interest to do the analysis and to have the data ready in case someone comes and said, I want to see that. So the difference is not really there. You do the same thing on both sides. It's just the difference is just the way how the inspectors treat that when they visit your company.
Indeed, I think that's a very important distinction that we're talking about here in terms of food and sort of the inspections and legislations and similar to what we might have here in the UK in terms of trading standards that would come in and check whether the products that are being sold on the shelves are legal and regulated as required, which are locally funded as well. So we've talked about sort of in the beginning the important lessons that German regulators need to learn. But because we are in the UK, if UK regulators were willing to reconsider Kava, and I hope if I do my job right, they would be. What is the single most important lesson they should take from the German experience?
Yeah, this is not only from the German experience. I'm working in that kind of thing, not only for Kava but also for other plants, and we frequently come up with the same problem that debates on safety are mostly hypothetical. So you are looking into a very tiny segment of a certain issue, and you're coming up with ideas with hypotheses, and you do not test them against real life. And that is something that needs to change. Because, for example, they would say we calculated a margin of exposure, which is a parameter they are using in toxicology for just having a benchmark for the how much of the population is at risk of having an adverse effect. And then they calculate from that, they calculate hypothetical benchmark doses, and they come up with a mechanism where they say, okay, now we have an effect from toxic from animal studies where nothing happened with this tiny dose. We divided it by 1,000 or 1 million to be on the safe side. This is not science. This is rubbish because it gives you an answer that is absolutely not in line with real life. Let's give you an example. Let's say someone said that oxygen is toxic. It is. If you can show that by toxicological studies that pure oxygen will kill you or will do damage to your body, whatever. This is also one of the reasons why in our atmosphere we can breathe it because it only has 18% and not 100%. Uh, Yes, it is toxic. So if I came to the idea to say, okay, we need to do something about that to protect our population, I would come out using this mechanism. I would come out with the result that 18% in the atmosphere is way too much. We should only have 0.18% in the atmosphere to survive. And then I would tell them, okay, try that. Let's see who lasts longer, you or me. So this shows you that it is entirely hypothetic, that approach, and that we need to change. We need to show that these mechanisms of risk assessment are, let's say, the harsh way. This is unfortunately you can ban anything using that approach, and you do not even need real arguments for that. And I think that is the thing we need to address, and we need to show that using that approach is not scientific and it cannot be the right way to assess the risk of Kava or for any other plant or any other material because it does not give you reliable results.
And I think this message strikes at the heart of many members of the diaspora because kava's consumed on well, it is consumed daily, regularly, and no thought is given behind
Yeah.
a question or no questions are given, cited on safety and other aspects of that. So it is, well, I don't want to say insulting, but it is pretty damning to actually talk about the hypothetical safety question when many people have been drinking kava for millennia, um, um, more than once a day, regularly, it's like putting a kettle on and having a cup of tea. Um, so finally, in that case, so I know one message that I think I will take on, and many of the diaspora and other Kava advocates should take on in the UK, is if you had to summarize the German Kava controversy in one lesson for UK policymakers, what would that lesson be?
Two things. Look at the evidence, look at the quality.
And that I think is a very apt uh, point to make because that links us back to right at the beginning and discussing how to reverse the ban. And on that very clear and succinct message, Dr. Schmidt, I really want to thank you for giving up your time to conduct this very informative interview with us. I certainly learned a lot myself. And I think we will try and remove the one swear word there that may have been part of your emotive call for Kava. But it was very important for us to shed a very important perspective on this, particularly from a grounded scientific approach, and show that proportionality is very important, and a blanket ban does not fit the criteria for that proportionality for Kava. So, on that note, thank you very much again for joining us, and I hope I'll have the opportunity to speak with you again after we've made some progress with Kava in the UK.
I hope you make some progress on Kava in the UK. That would be very important for us too in Germany because that would be something I could bring to court and say, look, others have
Done
progressed.
it. Yes, indeed. Well, I hope Britain will be leading the charge on that. Great. So